Tēnā tātou katoa. Tui ki te rangi, tui ki te whenua, tui ki te wana, tui ki te here tangata, e rongo te pō, e rongo te ao. Manawatia amatiriki, manawatia apuanga nā tohu o te tauhou te hei Māoriora. E mihi kawana ki te whare nei, te wānanga aronui o Tamaki Makaurau, e mihi kana ki te tangata hei whakatau ia tātou i te ata nei, nō reira tēnei te mihi ki a rātou. E mihi kawana ki ngā maunga whenua o te wāhi nei, i te iwi kāinga Ngāti Whātua o Rākei, te Waitemata, e mihi kawana ki a rātou. I te tāho tōku māma, ko maunga pohatu te maunga, tauranga te awa, tūhoi te iwi, Ngāti Raka te hapu, tātai a hape te marae, te pau te whānau. I te tāho tōku pāpā, nōko nei a hau, ko mātuku te reia, maunga whau, puke tapu nā maunga, Waitemata, te manuka nā Waiora, Waikato te awa, Ngāti te ata Waiohua te iwi, tāhuna te marae, te kiwi te whānau, nō reira e mihi kāna kia tātou. Kia ora everybody, my name's Johnnie Freeland, as already mentioned. Just really wanted to acknowledge Jerome and the team for organising our kaupapa, our gathering today. It's enabled me to come home from Wellington to hang out with my wife who's in the back and my whānau here. And so really wanted to acknowledge Jerome and the team for enabling that opportunity. And coming home is really important for me. And my kōrero this morning is sort of some observations, some insights, some reflections, some learnings, and some applied examples, because I get the sense you fellas are all doers and not always getting caught up in that theoretical space, and which is really important, because in the doing is the knowing, and it's all about practice, especially from Te Ao Māori sort of way of being. I just want to acknowledge PJ from Firth and her kōrero. My iwi is one of the iwi that Windstone are working with out at Pukekawa. But more than that, a few years ago, over 10 years ago, Windstones, as they were leaving their sand mine on the Waikato River, on the north side of the river, they actually gifted or returned their whenua to our iwi. And the work they've done in exiting out of our ancestral maunga and wiri there, Matuku Te Reia, it's 1/5 of its size. It's a acquired remnant of what was. And in leaving that place, the Windstones were talking with our people, and in their wisdom, they sort of gifted that land to Doc and Manukau City Council. And at some point, as the outcome of a treaty settlement, that maunga, or that leftover maunga, will get returned to our iwi. So I really just want to acknowledge what PJ said and the journey they're on to sort of return to the circle. I think that's the sort of theme of my kōrero this morning. And one thing that will really come through really strongly, it's all about wahine. So we'll sort of park that there and we'll sort of explore that. So there's some wahine I want to acknowledge in my kōrero. So one is Caroline Robinson, who'll be well known to the regenerates in the room. I think that's your term you use for yourselves. And also Lucy Tukua, who's a bit of hardcore regenerative Māori wahine. That actually introduced me to this regenerative thinking development space. And we've had a lot of fun, caused a lot of disruption over a number of years working in our mana whenua space. And And one thing, and with Rachel sort of talking about, she's our navigator for today. Navigation is really key around navigational leadership. And the space that sort of I work in, it's really important that we look to find spaces to co-navigate between regenerative thinking, which comes from a Western whakapapa, and Indigenous Te Ao Māori thinking, which comes from Papa Tunuku. And so there's a couple of co-navigators I want to acknowledge. Sarah Swart from Eke Pānuku. In the Puanui Mahi, she was a co-navigator with myself in this convergence between Te Ao Māori and regenerative thinking. And another wahine, Isabel Bruin-Kure, who was a co-navigator with me when we were doing the climate work between Auckland Council and our 19 mana whenua of Tamaki Makaurau. All wahine, and you might sort of get a sense that I've grown up, both my whakapapa sides are matriarchal in their nature. So I've sort of grown up under the wisdom of my nannies, my aunties, my mum, my wife, my daughters, and my mokopuna. So so that sort of gives a bit of a clue of how you need to be or who you need to be in the sort of navigational mahi, especially working in between two worlds. So I've got a bit of a presentation to take us through.
I te tīmatanga ko te kore, nā te kore ko te pō, ka puta ki te whaiao ki te ao mārama. Ko rangi nui e tui honei, ko papa tuanuku e takoto ake nei. Ko arau a tamariki, he atu, o te ngāhere, o te moana, o te hau, o te uenuku, o te puia, o te rūwhenua, o te aruhi, o te kūmara, o te wai Māori, o te tangata, ti hei mauri ora.
E aku ira tangata, he tupu koe no te whenua o tō whaia, he puna koe no ngā wai o o tūpuna, he māngai koe mo o manātua. Engari, nā tēnei ao hau, kua mumiti haere tō tāua hononga. Ka kite au i tōku oranga ki roto i a koe. Ka kite hoki koe i tō oranga ki roto i a hau. Ā, kua he katoa tāua, kua he katoa tātai. Kua tai te wā mā tāua anō tāua e whakaora. Ko au, ko koe, ko tāua.
So that video was done by Rangatahi when we were developing our mana whenua response to climate change. All those places are what Jerome mentioned in relation to Tamaki Makaurau, and would sort of reflect that that's a quick whakapapa audit, stock take of Tamaki Makaurau in terms of our whakapapa systems, but also an indication of the impacts on those whakapapa systems, especially over the last 200 years within this place called Auckland. We call it Tamaki Makaurau. So I'm sort of going to share about Indigenous Māori systems thinking and all the chaos, all the crisis that's happening around us in Aotearoa and throughout the world is sort of, and as Jerome mentioned, it's a real opportunity for us to have a think about how we reimagine, reframe, reset, not the current system, but where we can move towards or where we can move to. Sometimes we're looking for new solutions, but from an Indigenous perspective, they sit in old knowledge in the past, but not in the past that we have to go backwards, but in the past that informs our future moving forward together. And so that creates an opportunity for us to reorient our perspective, recirculise ourselves, and look to regenerate whakapapa and our well-being. So in terms of, I guess, what's the problem? Growing up, whenever an issue was presented to our old people, the first question I'd hear them ask is, hea ha te kaupapa, hea ha te take? What is this thing? And how does it relate to us, and how does it impact on us? So, and Jerome sort of mentioned some of these things, and I'm going to walk around because I'm not a lectern person. But it's really about, we're working towards sort of how we heal and regenerate the state of well-being or oranga of people, place, and nature. That's the heart of, in our terms, whakapapa-centred well-being. People, place, nature, and the interrelationships, whakapapa relationships between those elements. And for us, we're still dealing with the long-reaching impacts of all the shuns, colonisation, westernisation and urbanisation, and I use the term squareisation. And all of us as humanity have been locked into the hinaki or the eel trap of a square. And so, in essence, we're all trying to seek a return to the source. And our ukaipo, the place that sustains us, that feeds us, mai nā pito o nā taone nui, ki te rauru o papa tunuku. So from the pito, or those connections in the cities, but returning to the other part of our umbilical cord that's attached to papa tunuku. The pito is the part of the umbilical cord that stays with baby and drops off. And the rauru is the part of the umbilical cord that remains with the placenta and is attached to mum. So what we're trying to deal with is reattaching our umbilical cord back to papa tunuku. That's what the heart of regenerative thinking development is, from my view. And the imposition of square thinking on our indigenous spiral thinking has had a long-reaching impact over generations. The effects of the trauma have manifested in heaps of states of ill-being, and all the negative statistics around Māori reflect that. What Jerome talked about, the state of our waterways, our forests that aren't longer there, just in Waitakere and Hanua, that's the impact of square systems. And that's caused a disconnection, dislocation, and displacement. And the hopeful thing for Māori is that that's only been a 200-year process here in Aotearoa. But we think of other parts of the world. We think of many of our whanaunga from England. You guys have gone through thousands of years of disconnection, displacement. So the opportunity is, how do we start to regenerate? And for us, our view is it's all about oranga, it's all about well-being at the heart of it. So, we're all entrapped in the square to some degree. And so I guess I'm proposing, or in my particular practice, and when I say me, I'm talking about we, my whānau, my iwi, not just, I just happen to be an individual standing here, but we roll as whānau. So it's a bit embarrassing that I get asked as an individual to come and kōrero, when it's my whānau and the mahi they do that speaks for that, or speaks for us. So in terms of thinking about solution, our mātauranga Māori system of knowing, knowledge, thinking, experience, and wisdom. So this is not theoretical stuff. This is practice, knowing that's been handed down over generations. Not just in a human sense, but through our connections back to taiao, nature. And with the city things, they do a really good job of disconnecting us from nature. But in the pipes, the streams and the awa still flow. Under the concrete is still whenua. And so we see beyond the concrete and still see papa tunuku in a distressed form. And so what we bring as Indigenous people in this particular place is around 1,000 years. My whanaunga and Tūhoi, Tamati Cruiser, will say 2,000 years. But that's on the back of 50,000 years of being Pacific people. And if we think about the whenua, and what Jerome mentioned about 1 million years of volcanoes. We'll touch on one of our case studies, but the mouth of the Puanui stream, the geological features at the mouth are more than 20 million years old. They're old as the Hanuas, almost old as New Zealand. And so when we think about millions of years of knowing, that sits in the whenua, that sits in nature, how do we connect and untap that knowledge? Our elders will say, mātauranga isn't necessarily in a book, because it's a container to hold some stuff. It's not necessarily in people. We just sort of are repositories. The mātauranga actually sits in taiao in nature. And if we really regenerate those relationships with nature, they will reveal that knowledge, wisdom to us. And all we have is that we've had about 800 years of unbroken connection and 200 years of disconnection. So that's why I'm hopeful in terms of what we can do here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. One thing I've observed, and this has sort of been introduced into the regenerative space, and spending a little time in London and going to Egypt in 2020 and sneaking back into Aotearoa just literally a couple of weeks before COVID arrived, with 9 other matatau Māori language experts, where we got to observe a 7,000-year civilization who were connected to nature in the circle and then fell in the square, and then, well, they're no longer here. And so what we're sort of observing is that there's like 2 shifts and a convergence, like two streams of a river that are coming towards a confluence. And on one side, what we're seeing is a shift from square to circle. Square being that sort of Western thinking and practice, linear, extractive, patriarchal individualism, to more of this regenerative sort of circle. And coming again from that Western school of thought. But at the heart of that is about regenerating the partnership between humanity and nature at the essence. And at the same time, which has sort of been happening in Aotearoa for the last sort of 50, 60 years, and Jerome mentioned Whina Kupa as another example of a change navigator, is there's a shift within Māori, sort of moving out of the hinaki of a square and returning to our spiral systems. And we see that in the resurgence of our language, through kohanga reo, a whole range of activities. And one of the most amazing things that we've seen literally in the last 40 years, it'll be 40 years next year, is the whole regeneration of a knowledge system around voyaging and navigating. That 1,000 years ago, which was a given for our ancestors navigating throughout the Pacific, and then at some point we stopped going home. And since the late 1970s, mid-80s, people like Hector Busby, Hoturua Kerr, have regenerated a whole knowledge system and practice where we're now up to 3rd generation navigators. So that gives me hope and confidence that that can be done. And to boot, Team New Zealand, when they raced in Bermuda and San Francisco with the catamaran, they acknowledged the whakapapa of their catamaran back to Whakaora voyaging, and their type of knowledge and wisdom that took people to circumnavigate the whole Pacific. You know, going back a few thousand years, that's like the equivalent of going to the moon then, when you think about the knowledge and the wisdom. So we're seeing this shift, convergence, and actually today represents the shift and convergence, both in the regenerative conversations and the mātauranga Māori, Te Ao Māori conversations, and the fact that it's one of the few hui I've been to where heaps of Māori in it. You know? So how do we start to look at that dual wisdom in the way we can navigate forward? So it starting to come together. And what you see there are 2 circles, not a square and a circle. So for the sake of our future and the well-being of future generations, we actually need two circles starting to relate to each other. And so I sort of call this a binocular dual knowledge sort of framework, where regenerative thinking and practice can connect to mātauranga Māori thinking and practice and have a conversation around well-being. Now within this, one of the things about the square system, it's all about the ologies, but still splinters knowing. And I think the difference is the pursuit of knowledge is not the same as the pursuit of understanding or wisdom. That comes from lived experience. You know, how do we apply knowledge, not just have knowledge? And when we start to focus around oranga whakapapa, oranga whenua, oranga wai, oranga marae, oranga whānau, then we start to sort of not get caught so much in the ology space. Because in some of the work I've been doing with council, I work for a council, I used to work at Auckland Council, it's just that this connection of we create beautiful frameworks but apply it to one ology. We don't see how we can apply it across, and we spend a whole lot of energy diving down into these little rabbit holes. And I guess one of the learnings is next time you're outside at night, look at the stars. We spend a whole lot of time trying to connect them, like especially during matariki. How do we see puanga? How do we see matariki? But the thing is, they're already connected through space. It's the space that connects all the stars. And from a Te Ao Māori perspective, there's as many Te Ao Māori views as there are stars. So the thing is, don't try to find the Te Ao Māori view. Because that's one challenge about Western thinking. You try to find the answer, not a answer. And so that's why we're different. That's why, you know, we have over 500 maramataka across the country, because it's linking back to place and those ecological whakapapa systems and understanding it. So that's why a lot of cut and paste type things don't work, because we don't spend the time to get to know and understand that place and location and the people and all those things. So ologies and tangas. So tanga, I love tangas. Some people feel they're overdone. You know, manaki tanga and whanaunga tanga. But the tangas are two things, and the tanga is the important part. Because tanga are like lashings on the waka that ties everything together. And in the term tanga is two sort of things. One is it turns a noun to a verb, so it's about doing. Manaki tanga is the action of manaki. But also within the tanga or the code is about reciprocity. And what are we giving and what are we receiving, and actually receive in the giving. Especially from a relationship. So manaki tanga, kaitiaki tanga, te aki tanga, they're all different aspects of reciprocity. And if we're not aware of those things and coming from an ology view, then we're going to miss the point. Some insights, and you know, we're still in COVID, but we had quite an exciting time. I was in Tāmaki when we went for a 100-day lockdown. But I threw up a whole lot of learnings, and not just because of COVID, but when we think about oranga. And so also at the same time, Auckland had a water crisis. So we had to sort of pati Waikato to get some more water through the pipeline. You know, and that's a real failure of vision and understanding, not just infrastructure. But one of the things is that whether whānau being in crisis, COVID, climate, water crisis, inequity, poverty, are all interconnected. It's all about oranga, it's all about well-being. The challenges that we are facing presently are an opportunity for us, again, to reframe, to reimagine. You know, a lot of the sort of dialogue was about, when are we going back to normal? You know, we lost patience humanity probably wasn't in a rahui or lockdown since the Ice Age, and we couldn't handle it. Because we've developed a sprint drive-through mentality, not a marathon endurance mentality. But in that, the first lockdown especially, what we observed was, oh, the birds are returning, fish are returning, oh, water quality is improving. But we couldn't wait to get out, drive our cars and get back to all that space, you know? So sometimes we can't help ourselves and we miss out on seeing the things that are hidden in plain sight. And so from a Māori perspective, vulnerability, adaptation and resilience are not new concepts for us. We had 800 years of thriving and we've had 200 years of surviving. The opportunity for regenerative thinking is how do we return to thriving? And not just Māori as a population, I'm talking about nature, place, all those things. Other insights, and this is where long memory is really helpful. So we experienced a pandemic in 1918 and how the influenza impacted on many of our communities. Within my whānau, my great-great-great-grandmother and her daughter died within 3 days. We couldn't bring them home to our whitu, so they're buried at Whakaora Cemetery in Onehonga. You know, so those memories. So through mum and them, they're really cautious about dealing with this because of those memories, and those sort of help us, despite all the confusion, the anger, and sort of the discombobulation that's happening. And you know, one thing that sort of blew me away was just again that, you know, that way of navigating from that knowledge of our past. And then also, it's brought a sharper focus on a whole range of things. And I heard a quote during that time, there's nothing like a good pandemic to lift the scab of all the paru that sits in society. You know, because it impacts on everyone. And so, you know, things that we saw, Donald Trump flags and Tino Rangatira flags at the same place. You know? And that just shows the state of our people in terms of their mamai, their hurt, their desperation, trying to find a way. It was never about vax or no vax. There was a whole distraction. It was really about the care of whakapapa. And the issue was, at the heart for Māori, was we've had 200 years of mistrust of colonisation in the Crown, and why would we rely on the Crown to help us? You know, and what it led to is Māori having to look after themselves to try and navigate with a whole range of agencies, but that frontline response. And so what we discovered is, what would a Māori-led response for everything look like, not just COVID? Maybe that could be the new normal. You know? So our old people say, whether it's COVID or climate change, it's a papa tunuku response to poor human behaviour. That's what we see. That's what we're learning. You know, it's not we need a climate response over here, and we need a COVID response over there, and we need a housing response over there. That creates a whole lot of confusion, and we use the term rangirua, sort of two minds, and it's a step to pōrangi, where we sort of go out of our mind. You know, and so a lot of pressure on families, a lot of pressure on systems. So where do we look to? We have this Māori formula, our Māori maths. Might be a bit different to Western maths, but our formula is 1 + 1 = 3. And it's modelled through papa, tunuku and rangi nui. So ko papa, ko rangi, ka puta. So we're all children, we're all mokopuna of papa, tunuku and rangi nui. That's our term, that's our language in this location. Other places of the world, they have their other names. But for here in Aotearoa, because, you know, place-based thinking is using this sort of framing. But at the heart of that is ko au, ko koe, ko tawa. You and me make the we. So we is a real critical part in thinking about solutions. And what can we do together from a regenerative thinking, Te Ao Māori thinking around some of the solutions. And in this time, last 3 to 5 years, I've had all these sort of engineers and designers and others sort of come into my circle, which I've never experienced before. And one thing I've learned about engineers is they love solutions. But we want them to do circle and spiral solutions in that opportunity. And it's all about perspective. You don't really fully appreciate Papua Tunuka and Rangi Nui until we put our perspective from the moon. So those people up in the space station or go to space have an awesome opportunity to see Rangi and Papa in their full view. And this whakatauki, tauparapara karakia, just really acknowledges all the connections that we have to the sky, to the land, to water, to each other. And I had to put the top part up because one of my nannies sort of said I had to, or that I'd get the jam speed. But she talks about, we all tamariki of Papa Tunuku and Rangi Nui, we use the short-term nukurangi. What is required of us, and this is in Papa Tunuku response to poor human behaviour. What is required of us is a nukurangi anchored, wahine-led response to regenerating whakapapa-centred wellbeing. Now that's not new for Māori. You know, this patriarchal 500-year thing sort of outdated. You know, we've got to really, if we're going to really reframe, and this is not about equity or pay equity and that, because Papa Tunuku and Wahine are the same. You know, they're our whare tangata. They're the house of future generations. And if we don't care for her and them, then we're lost. So I'm into this, what I call whakapapa-centred design logic. Basically, what that means, if it makes sense to our old people, it makes sense to our rangatahi, then it makes sense. And within this is the order, if you like, around what we call our tuapapa, our foundational elements, rangi, papa, te tamariki, the kawa that comes out of that. Kawa is like a system or a way of being. And then that informs whatever our kaupapa are, whether it's about building papa kainga, regenerating streams, whatever. It's informed and anchored in terms of those whakapapa back to people, place, nature. Our tikanga are those values and principles that guide our actions. The mahinga is the doing, how we get stuff done. And then arotakinga is a whakapapa-centred way of monitoring and evaluating where we are, what is the state, what is the impact benefit. Te whakaoranga, that's the term around whakapapa-centred wellbeing, but it's also a term very almost the same as whakaora. And whakaora is to cause wellbeing, to initiate. You know, when you got a whaka in front of something, like whakatane, and WH in te reo is the F sound, is to cause, to create that movement. For other dialects, it might be haka, for our Tai Tokoro people, but it's to cause movement. And the ora is around to cause, enable wellbeing. How we do this in this context is our reconnection, you know, physically, spiritually, and mentally to place, to each other, to whakapapa. Whakarauora is sort of my term for regenerating. And it's about how we regenerate and restore the mana, tapu, and mauri of spaces, places, and races in terms of people. And wānanga, we're in wānanga mode now. And wānanga for me is the practice of time and space, not just gathering to learn something, but that's part of it. Like this place is te wānanga or aranui or tamaki makaurau. So it's creating space and holding space for us to come together to explore, to discover, to share. Now, the wānanga I talk about is one of the consequences of colonisation is they introduce chronological time to the space. Even the Greeks have two names for time, chronos and kairos. And chronos is sequential time, tick-tock time, hamster wheel time, Gregorian calendar. So that's a human-created element to entrap us because it seems like we never have enough time, time's running out, or we're chasing time. Whereas we need to recalibrate into, so Māori have the term te taima, which is tick-tock time, and then we have the term te wā, which is the base word of wānanga. So the shift to te wā, and te wā is nature's time. I was talking to my whanaunga te rana earlier with Jerome, and he was a little bit worried that we weren't on time. And I said, it's all good, we're in tūhoi time here now, because we'll start when we're ready to start. You know, those who are here are here, whether they're online or in person, you know, and that's when we move. And one of the things that COVID was trying to help us to teach us, the importance of te wā through the lockdown. And those that were lucky enough to spend their time with whānau, for my whānau, I went and grabbed my two boys who were flatting in town, and went, you got to come home. So we had 8 in our bubble. So we had 4 generations in my bubble, my mum, my wife and I, our tamariki and a mokopuna. We had a touch team. You know, but we'll never ever live that time again. Unless there's some other issue that we have to go to another lockdown. And knowing that many whānau suffered, those that were in apartments a whole that couldn't even put feet on the grass. So the importance of understanding the nature's time, and that's the most challenge. If there's a big challenge for us to overcome, it's our relationship to time. Council, you know, local government number, we're so driven by time, project time and all that, that we force our communities into the hinaki of time. Yet we have all the power to slow time down, like Maui, in order to connect, engage, and be in time with our people, with nature. You know, this Gregorian thing, 1 September's spring. We live over in Turanga or Woodford. There's already lambs and daffodils that have already arrived in the last 2 or 3 weeks. Now, are they wrong because it's not 1 September? Or we haven't realised that the Gregorian calendar is shifting because nature's shifting. So we're losing our time and pace with nature. So this is the most critical thing, if we're thinking about regenerating well-being, is that we've got to come to terms to how we manage and use time. Now we can use it interchangeably. It doesn't mean you have to choose one or the other, because we're in this convergence time. But one of the key things is about our time, nature's clock, and how do we need to get back in time with nature. Some kawa, and te kawa te tiriti, and what that means, not only in this piece of paper and 1840 thing, but the treaty was signed in many places across Aotearoa. So we need to locate treaty locally, not just this national thing, to make sense of it, because many of the iwi in your areas may have signed the treaty. So you're dealing with the descendants of treaty signers, not just this thing that happened in Waitangi. And we're talking about the treaty itself, the articles and the spirit of the treaty. We're not talking about principles. They fall within te kawa te ture, which is those statutory things. And because treaty principles are a construct of the ture, of the law, and they're a watered-down version of the treaty, and sometimes the treaty principles have created a discombobulation and confusion. But at the heart of it, it's about relationships. And it's not about what the state of the relationship was in 1840, it's the state of the relationship now and how you can work that through. Because each generation's got to make sense of it for that context, for that time and that location. Te kawa te oranga, we've sort of been talking about that whakapapa-centred wellbeing. And te kawa te whenua, this is another critical thing, is that the whenua is the anchoring for everyone. And one of the important things to understand is mana whenua, or tangata whenua of that area, aren't just a stakeholder for consultation or engagement. They are the human manifestation of that whakapapa system. So they are the whenua. And certainly in Auckland, one thing we've observed is 30 years of cultural amnesia. Because we're just dealing with Māori or whatever sect they're in, oh, that's the group. We've lost sight of the whenua. And some of the things that are happening now are really exciting from a mana whenua perspective because, you know, mana whenua and tamaki only make up 15% of the overall Māori population. We have over 160,000 Māori living in Auckland. But we lose sight of the whenua, which is ironic given that most of us work in place-based type of work. And then the other sort of key thing is how we navigate horizons of well-being, and Rachel mentioned about navigating. And so, again, talking about our bringing that knowledge system around navigation. And one of the things, the most critical thing in here is our pai tawhito, our horizon behind us. So when I talked about 1,000 years, 50,000 years, the last 200 years, it's about looking back to understand where we are now. That informs our pai watu, our current state or present location. And then how do we start to envision that future? And often we talk about a compass, but a Māori compass is slightly different because the compass sits in nature. You know, how we navigate by the stars, how we look to the indicators of change that all come from nature, that tell us where things are, seasons, and all that sort of thing. And then how we get aspirational in terms of the waypoints we want to navigate towards along the way, the outcomes we want to achieve, but ultimately what does destination. So our ancestors sat on the beach in Hawaii, had a hui, like this, and it's like, we're not quite clear what was the driver for them to leave the Pacific. But if you've watched that movie, Moana, I recommend you watch it because there's a Māori Pacific Da Vinci Code in there about navigation and led by a wahine. But what drove our ancestors not only to get on a waka, but they had to design it, build it, get on it, get a crew, work out who's coming, who's staying, get to a point where all the knowledge and skills they had and provisions just beyond the point you can't turn around, you got to keep going, that everything from that point become new. New learning, new experience. You know, so that sort of learning, that sort of system can help us navigate through ambiguity, uncertainty, change. You know, it might have been COVID, it might have been climate change, it might have been overpopulation. Some of our narratives talk about all those sort of things that caused someone to reimagine, reset, and actually regenerate a whole new pathway. And then not only get here, and then become this place. You know, so that sort of way of thinking, but often what I see in a lot of our thinking from a Western is all about future options or future scenarios. We're not quite connected to our horizon behind us. I need a good design person to work with me to make this more like an animation, so that we, if you can imagine how we move through the space too, because it sort of comes across linear. But for those of you who have been on a boat or a waka, the horizon's a circle. It's not this linear, you know, so again, circular thinking, circular. But what helps us understand where we are, where we've come from and where we're going, is the positions of the stars, the different indicators of the waves and all those sort of things. So those are all nature's ecological compasses that we're not quite seeing around us. And it don't have to be on the water to be that. The way we move through land and other environments are the same. So in terms of, I guess, leading up to this part, location, 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 it's a key sort of thought. And so that's thinking about how we need to locate ourselves into three different places, but they're all connected. So one is cultural location, a te ao Māori. How do we start to acknowledge and locate our thinking or within a te ao Māori sort of cultural location? And people, place, nature, connecting, regenerating and recalibrating time. And one of the things I've learned, if we want to transform or influence or navigate change, there's 3 touch points we've got to do at the same time. So systems, we always think about systems change. How do we transform systems? That's really important, you know, and as Jerome said, shifting our consciousness. But then we've got to anchor it to a place. And what I've learned over the last few years is to locate it within a catchment. Because the flow of water, the whakapapa of water, creates a connectivity around place. And it's not just about communities, because our little case study of Te Puanui, you'll understand when I sort of talk about what communities mean in that context. Because often a community development approach targets one group, not the communities of a catchment. And then the third sort of area is around whānau, family. You know, what are we doing at a family whānau level to support them, to enable them to navigate their pathways of well-being? And we've got to sort of touch these 3 points concurrently, otherwise we're not going to move anything. And the other key thing I've learned, if we really want transgenerational change, Puanui, for example, is a 50-year sort of program, but we've got to get out of that 50-year thing into how many generations. And what's really critical is you need at least 3 living generations together to enable transformational change over generations. Whether that's your whakapapa family or your kaupapa family. So I'm really lucky that I live in a 4-generational whare. My mum turns 82 in October, and our mokopuna who lives at home just turned 10 this year. Now, when they sit together, that's my mum, my wife, our daughter, and our granddaughter, 4 wahine again. Mum was brought up by her great-grandparents in Waiwaho. So that's another 3 generations in mum's living memory that she brings to her. And then with our moko and her growing up, how many generations is she going to have by the time she's 82? You know, that's regenerative action right there, because we form groups, but we're not thinking intergenerationally. We're not thinking about at least 3 generations. And what's exciting in the Puanui is that we've got a whole lot of retired, you know, friends of the river, friends of the park, or those sort of awesome volunteer care groups. But often they're working, coming together, but not with any of their tamariki or grandchildren. And then we've got all these rangatahi rōpū in the Puanui that are doing things, and what we want to try and do is connect the generations up. Because the wisdom of our elders and that enthusiasm of our young people, that's how we get the transmission of knowledge and values. So you sort of got to think about that, at least 3 generations. Anchoring to place is really important. So this is sort of the Puanui catchment. There's our 1/5 of our maunga in the bottom there. And McLaughlin's Hill is the English name, but most of it's been quarried. Our iwi name is Ngāti Tiata, and we descend from a woman called Tiata Arihia who was born on that maunga. So when we think about place catchment, and this is where that little trick, I call it Māori GPS, my mountain, my river, and my people. People, place, nature as a bit of a GPS coordinate. And then I already mentioned about time, place, time, space, and how we need to really get in tune. And how we get in tune is observing nature. You know, I mentioned Matariki and Puanga at the beginning. That marks the Māori sort of New Year. So that's a marker in time from the sky. From a Maramataka lunar celestial calendar view, is every month has a star. And there's different indicators, environmental indicators. I think that's the Pākehā term. We call it tohu. So, for example, our nannies talk about when fish with the red row, when the trees with red flowers are blooming, the fish with the red row are running. Or when the trees with the yellow flowers are blooming, then the fish with the yellow row are running. So they're all interconnected in terms of those indicators, and that's all sitting around us, but we're not seeing them. And then te aro takinga is that whakapapa-centred well-being monitoring and evaluation, and it's actually 4 lenses. So one is aro tuhura, which is around developmental evaluation. So what are the insights and information and learnings we can gain as we're in project or in the journey? And how do we recognise and harvest those to make adjustments as we go? Because often a lot of our evaluation work happens after we look back, but this is around real time thinking about that. Aro turiki, monitoring and reporting. So how do we recognise, acknowledge and celebrate movement and progress? So that's that whole starting to monitor what are some of the indicators or tohu that we can use to actually be able to measure and monitor that movement, progress and achievement. Now in our results-based world at the moment, it's all about the achievements and we don't harness the movement and the progress. And we play in the physical movement and activity space with whānau and getting them to move and learn how to swim, how to ride a bike, and then they go and do something like I Am Māori or triathlon. Now one of the little mantras of movement we have is, and some of them got it on their t-shirt, is at least you're beating the couch. So it's not always about how many times they cross the finish line, it's actually the times they get up to go for a swim, to move or whānau or whatever it is. And the biggest challenge is always getting to the start line, never the finish. And the aro matawai is about assessment of impact and benefit. So what have we achieved? What have we influenced? What has been the outcomes we've contributed to that have had positive impacts and benefits around well-being of our whakapapa systems? Drawing on data, both from a qualitative and a quantitative, those sort of, that information. And then aro tuaru, the Western sort of thinking, let's call it risk management. Māori don't have a concept of risk. Otherwise, I don't think we would have gone on a waka. We have terms like kia tūpato, kia atahaere, kia hiwara, like be careful, be mindful, be aware, but we don't have this thing called risk. And so you need a bit of Maui spirit to harness the sun, and for those who've seen Moana again, Maui's a character, talks about his deeds. But what's really interesting in that depiction, they don't talk about all the wahine that enabled him to do what he did, and the wahine that were the sources of knowledge to enable what he did. So they talk about his grandmother's jawbone to fish up the ika Maui. He went to Mahuika to learn how to do fire. But see, because it's still sitting in a Western frame in Disney, there's enough code in there to get a sense, but there's other code that's been left out, wahine. So when we talk about aro tūraru, is about how we navigate vulnerability, resilience and adaptability through challenges and adversity and those sort of elements. So that's a different sort of knowing and being aware. We want to arrive in our destination where no one's fallen off the waka or we've had to throw people off the waka, because we need everyone. So when we have a raru on the waka, we might need to have a stop rather than keep going. So again, being in time with each other, with nature. What's our time? 4 minutes left? Okay, sweet. Well, hopefully you got another sense of whakapapa-centred design, whakapapa-centred well-being, and sort of Māori systems. And I'm happy for this slide deck to be shared. I'm not divulging any tapu information. But this is our view of Tamaki Makaurau. Mahurangi's the harbour, so that's 4. But Kaipara, Waitemata, the Manukau, but also the Waikato River. Te Monanui a Rehua our Tasman seat. Te mona nui a toi, or tikapa moana, depending on which iwi you are. So Tāmaki Makaurau's whakapapa is about water. That's why catchments are so critical in this place, but any place across Aotearoa. Where I live is at, so we're near the te huku o te ika, the tail of the fish. I live at the upoko in Poneke. So te upoko te ika is not just another name for Wellington, it's the head of the fish. And the fact that it's co-located with the capital, how can we influence the whole fish and the waka of the South Island? So this is sort of what Māori worldviews can help unlock and bring. I might stop there because I was going to go on to a couple of examples of Te Taruki a Tāwhiri and the Puanui work. But I might just finish off a video if I can skip to a video and it'll sort of tie it all up. Is that one going to play? Oh, there we go.
Transform Manukau is one of Panuku's key locations in Auckland. It's been recognised as a centre for urban growth, and as part of that we created a framework plan to help guide the way that growth would happen. And in that framework plan, the restoration of the Puanui stream was identified as one of the key moves. The idea of kaitiakitanga has been incredibly important since the inception of a project. We've always recognised the role that mana whenua play as kaitiaki of Te Puanui and wanted to start the project working alongside them to develop a vision.
Ko matuku te reia te maunga, ko te puhunui te awa, ko te manukanuku hoturoa, te Whakaora, ko Ngāti Tiata, Waiohua te iwi, ko Johnnie Freeland toko ingoa. Te Whakaora tanga i te Puanui is the name of our program, and it's anchored in those relationships between people, place and nature. The challenge, the wero that mana whenua laid, and there's where our mana whenua whanaunga from across Tāmaki Makaurau challenge Panuku to really lift out of consultation and engagement mode and really explore collaborative partnering in a real meaningful level. I think one of the challenges, which is the exciting thing, is bringing together a number of partners. Our three mana whenua iwi of Te Waiohua are working together alongside our two local boards, Auckland Council, Panuku and our community alongside central government agencies. So one of those challenges is how do you start to bring together those diverse views and perspectives. Our first critical step from a Waiohua perspective was that we actually formed and laid a kaupapa document, which really articulating a vision, affirming some values and guiding principles to act as a compass, if you like. We were able to then develop a charter, and that charter becomes a shared commitment by everyone, and it creates that point of visibility in how we want to navigate forward. So when we talk about people, place and nature, taiao, tangata and whenua, it really represents that holistic systems view of whakapapa-centred wellbeing. So rather than approaching it as a stream restoration type project or a community development type project, we've brought those elements together and recognising the water cycle within the Puanui catchment. So a catchment place-based approach. I'd like to see a mana whenua anchored pathway which are led by our community and our local families of the catchment.
Panuku's Governance Forum allows us to have really important foundational conversations with the chairs of the local iwi, and it's an incredible privilege to be working at that level in the iwi with them to establish the foundations from the outset, and then expanding that out to a sense of tiakitanga, which means the wider community is also involved in restoring Te Puanui.
What's really exciting at the moment, whether it's climate action, COVID, poverty, inequity, what we're seeing not only in Aotearoa but around the world is a broader shift from Western square, extractive, patriarchal sort of individualism type systems more into regenerative sort of circular thinking, and it's really focused on how we restore the relationship, partnership between humanity and nature.
And I just want to leave you guys with two thoughts. So this beautiful whakatauki, that's Haunui Waka on a full moon heading down the east coast from Auckland. And the whakaaro there is Te Rohia, kia marama, whawhangia kia rango nā te ha. So observe to gain enlightenment, but participate to feel the essence. So it's all about that action. It's all about knowing and the doing. And then just my final thoughts, whether this is a challenge or affirmation. But as tangata whenua, as tamariki o Papa Tunuku and Rangi Nui, as regenerative practitioners, we have the opportunity to recirculise our minds, understand our symbiotic whakapapa relationships with nature and the universe, with this place, and with each other. We need to understand that the answer we're seeking sits in the greater sense of self, not the me, but the we. Our whakaoranga pathway sits within our circular regenerative thinking and our spiral takarangi mātaranga Māori thinking, knowing, experiencing and being. Through observation, reflection and practice of our beliefs and values that must guide, define and inform everything we do. Within the evolution of regenerating the partnership between nature and humanity, non-Indigenous people are seeking a return to the source. Regenerating their own indigeneity. That might be a tapu term, but I think we're all on that journey, if I wanted to acknowledge that. But the question is, where's the place of the regeneration of the well-being of Indigenous peoples? We are nature. We don't need to regenerate the partnership between humanity and nature. We are nature. We, our experience, knowledge and wisdom can play a key role in navigating the return of humanity back to the circle of nature. We can welcome you back, or karanga you back to the circle as well. And if permitted, to heal ourselves and heal the mukapuna of the colonisers and heal our relationships, restore balance and harmony within our planet. So that's both a thought and a challenge. Little soft one. I'm not like my whanaunga tamaiti or any of our other whanaunga, but we're all disruptors. And I think we all collectively are disruptors, otherwise we wouldn't be here. So, e mihi ukana kia koutou I tēnei wā, aroha nui ki taku taima, I tūau I te wā, nō reira huri noa, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.